Good morning, brothers. Today we will speak about Giacomo Leopardi. Along with Alessandro Manzoni and Ugo Foscolo, one of the three great poets of the Italian Romanticism. He was born on the 29th of June, 1798, and he died on the 14th of June, 1837. Recently, I found out that not this, but last year's Lent, the Diocese of Rome had dedicated a series of lectures to Giacomo Leopardi for Lent. And that caught my attention because Giacomo Leopardi is an atheist, he's a nihilist, actually a nihilist who takes nihilism to its ultimate consequences. He's a pessimist, he's an existentialist, he's a materialist. So why would the Diocese of Rome pay any attention to him? What does Giacomo Leopardi have to do with Lent? The answer of Don Fabio Rossini was everything. Because he's the poet of death. And let me read you a quote from The Power of Silence by Cardinal Robert Sarah. Number 161. We forget that the source of our troubles comes from the illusion that we are something other than mere dust. The man who makes himself God no longer wants to know that he is mortal. Psalm 103 says that God himself knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. As for man, his days are like grass. He flourishes like a flower of the field. For the wind passes over him, and it's gone, and its place knows it no more. These reflections about death bring Giacomo Leopardi into the scene, and in a very powerful way. I'm not going to be quoting or referencing the studies I read, just be aware of the fact that most of the studies I read were in Italian, so maybe they are not accessible to you. Nevertheless, if it catches your attention, so I don't have to be quoting them over and over again. Apart from Giacomo Leopardi's own writings, there's the very good study that Giuseppe Uboldi wrote, Franco Volpi, who calls him that great master of nothingness, who's Leopardi, Luigi Gaudio, Alejandro Marzioni, and of course the great study that the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer wrote about Giacomo Leopardi. He was born, as you know, in 1789 in Le Marche, and the city was, or the town was, Recanati. That was still part of the Pontifical States. It was ruled by the papacy. His father, Monaldo Leopardi, was an aristocrat. He was fond of literature and political thinking, but he was leaning mostly, or actually strongly, toward the conservative side. He was a monarchic, to the core. His mother, Adelaide, was a very pious woman, sometimes to the point of fanatism and religious fanatism, and she was also very strict, very severe with her son Giacomo and the other two children. So Giacomo had two siblings. Since a very early age, his father hired two priests to be Giacomo Leopardi's tutors and preceptors. So they instructed Giacomo Leopardi, and he learned the Latin, Greek, and Hebrew from a very early age. But above all, he was a self-taught erudite. He taught himself most of what he knew, to the point that at the age of 15, he was regarded as a self-taught philologist and a self-taught erudite. You can imagine Giacomo Leopardi as a teenager who was insolent and maybe he liked to mock other scholars. So in 1816, he was aged like 17 years. He wrote the Hymn to Neptune. He wrote it in ancient Greek. Hymn to Neptune. He wrote this hymn in ancient Greek and then somehow made it pass like it was an ancient manuscript, like it was retrieved from an ancient manuscript. So scholars started conjecturing about this manuscript or this poem. Oh yeah, the poetry seems like that of Bacchylides, or could it be maybe that of Pindar? And they were asking themselves who was the great ancient poet, who was the Greek poet from antiquity that had written that poem. And then this 17-year-old Giacomo Leopardi comes up and mocks them, saying, I just wrote it. Yes, so he could very easily take in and deceive any of the scholars in his time. As a teenager, also, it is here where he starts singing about love. Memorie del primo amore, memories of his first love, who was Gertrude Casi-Lazzari. Unfortunately, she dies. And by the way, it's not going to be the only sad ending story. Actually, there's not a single happy ending story in all of the life of Giacomo Leopardi as far as it has to do with his love life. His love was never requited. And, well, this brings in a new touch to the thought and to the poetry of Giacomo Leopardi. Another important influence in 1817 is the acquaintance of Pietro Giordani. He was a political thinker who motivated Leopardi, let's say it like this, to think outside the box, to think outside of the monarchic standards his father had instilled in him, and promoting the spirit of Risorgimento. Promoting the spirit of Risorgimento meant that they were looking for not only a cultural but also a political unification of Italy. You know that Giacomo Leopardi never lived to see this, but he was one of the great proponents of the Risorgimento. Actually, he has a poem whose title is Risorgimento. In 1818, he published Primi Canti, his first songs, and he starts crystallizing this materialistic view and this pessimistic and nihilistic view. For example, in a letter to his father of 1819, most of these are translations I made for this, so please be indulgent if I should stumble because I am translating from Italian, but he says, I'd rather be unhappy than small. I'd rather suffer than get bored. So suffering is that which makes Giacomo Leopardi feel like he is alive, like he has something to do and like his life matters. From 1819 to 1821, he dedicated himself to writing idyllic poems, among which you have some poems in the anthology, like L'Infinito, the Infinite, and L'ultimo canto di Sappho, the last song of Sappho, the Greek poet, you remember, right? Yes. 1822, he visited Rome, but he was bitterly disappointed. On the one hand, for the corruption of the church, according to his own testimony, and on the second hand, because of how dull intellectual life was in Rome. They were all clinging to conventions and he didn't find it enticing, so he had to come back to his family. And let us put it like this. He had left his home in Recanati because he wanted to withdraw away from his father's influence. That's why he went to Rome. So, not being able to make a living in Rome and to stay in Rome and to find in Rome a favorable environment, he had to come back to Recanati, meaning that he could not gravitate away from the influence, from the overbearing influence of his father, of his family in general, but especially of his father. So he was bound to them. And this was something that hampered not only his movement around, but especially his thought. He wanted to think outside of the molds that had been handed over to him. By the way, his health was always very poor. His health was always very poor. It was maybe around this time when he practically lost his sight. So we have a blind writer, or almost blind writer. The point is he could not read anymore. So imagine Giacomo Leopardi piling up all the knowledge that he had gained from books in his early 20s. After that, he went blind. So it was all in his mind. He could not read anymore. He could not gain access to more sources. So it was everything. He was producing everything from his mind. Not only his blindness, but also his bone tuberculosis, which, as you can imagine, or maybe you cannot imagine, but it was incredibly painful, along with many other ailments. And bone tuberculosis also caused bone deformities in him, to the point that he had not one but two humps. He was a hunchback, but not once but twice. Of course, this made him ugly, and that made his love to be unrequited over and over again, because he was not attractive. He had no physical attraction. And in this way, you can also understand the last song of Sappho. Although we don't know of Sappho being ugly, Giacomo Leopardi impersonates this Greek poet and makes her ugly because he is portraying his own feelings and his own deformity and his own ugliness in this poet. By the way, this is the last song of Sappho, meaning just before her suicide. And what was the cause of suicide, at least according to the legend? Unrequited love. Shortly after his return from Rome, he practically abandoned poetry, and he dedicated himself mostly to philosophy and to writing the moral dialogues. So most of the poetry that Giacomo Leopardi bequeathed us was written early in his life, in his teenage years, or maybe in his early 20s. There are a few exceptions, but for the most, he left poetry aside. In 1824, he finally met someone who appreciated his talent. His name was Stella, and he owned a bookstore in Milan. This is the first time when Giacomo Leopardi can successfully leave the orbit of his family, and he could move to Milan and to Bologna to work with his publisher, Stella. In 1827, he met personally Alessandro Manzoni. Alessandro Manzoni was at the time already a very well-established novelist. It's important to highlight that Giacomo Leopardi was a disappointment to many intellectuals and scholars in his time, because when they spotted him as a young man and they saw how brilliant he was, they saw his talent, they expected Giacomo Leopardi would become the new Alessandro Manzoni, a well-established novelist. And you know, Alessandro Manzoni, after he converted to Catholicism, became a devout Catholic, and you see his Catholic views and his Catholic thinking in his great work, which is The Betrothed, I Promessi Sposi. Most scholars and intellectuals back then were clergymen. So of course, they had great expectations for Giacomo Leopardi, this gifted young man, and they wanted him to become a second Alessandro Manzoni. When he rather diverted into materialism, nihilism, atheism, and pessimism, they were very disappointed on him. That also explains why intellectual circles hardly ever regarded Giacomo Leopardi in his lifetime. He thought he would be forgotten. He didn't think his poetry would endure and last, and he didn't think that he would be renowned as one of the greatest Italian poets who ever lived. because in his lifetime he was rejected, also by academic circles. It's important to highlight also that he was offered 2 teaching positions in Germany, one in the University of Bonn and the other one in the University of Berlin. However, his poor health didn't let him undertake the journey, didn't let him undertake the assignments, so he had to resign. It is also along this time when he wrote the famous poem Risorgimento. I think you have it in the anthology. And this is an exception, because as I mentioned, he had already given up poetry. But maybe once or twice he wrote poems once again. And by the way, his final writing, his last testament, La Ginestra. Ginestra is a flower. In English, it's also Ginestra. In Spanish, it's retama. So it's a flower, tiny, not very beautiful, yellowish. But what is remarkable about that flower is how hardy it is, how enduring, how lasting it is. And that was Giacomo Leopardi's last testament, which was also a poem. So when I said that he left poetry aside, I don't want to make this an absolute, and of course there were poems along his life. One of his greatest friends would be called Ranieri, and he would also become his editor. And it was thanks to Ranieri that Giacomo Leopardi could go to Naples, where he spent his final years. He was already infected with bone tuberculosis at the time. And I don't think he was hoping to recover from this terminal illness, but nevertheless, this could be some kind of remedy, at least a temporal one, that would palliate his sufferings, moving to a better weather. But unfortunately for Giacomo Leopardi and for literature, there struck an epidemic of cholera. And being infected with bone tuberculosis, he didn't die of tuberculosis like most romantics, he died of cholera. There's still speculation, but most reputable sources say that he died from cholera in 1837. In the life of Giacomo Leopardi, we see at least 2 major transitions, and it is not like I am making this up. Most scholars refer to these major transitions, and again, it's not like they are making it up. They refer to Giacomo Leopardi's own testimony. He began writing his diary, his journal, like around 1817, and the densest part of all his journal, the title is Lo Zibaldone, meaning that he mixed all kinds of thoughts. Okay, so it's his journal where he poured everything that he was carrying in his spirit. The densest part goes from 1817 to 1821. After 1821, he still wrote his journal, but it was something intermittent. He didn't write consistently, and the last entry dates of the 4th of December of 1832. Almost 5 years before his death. In this journal, he speaks about 2 major transitions in his life, or in his thought. One is from erudition to poetry, and the other one is from poetry to truth. Another way of calling them is erudition toward il bello, toward beauty. This transition happens around the year 1816. Giacomo Leopardi becomes aware of the fact that he had practically exhausted all knowledge of his time regarding erudition. Was there anything else for him to invest his thought in? Yes, beauty. So he realizes that piling up knowledge is not enough. that he had already done that, not only to a significant extent, but he had already done it to the point of exhaustion. It is then when he transitions toward a quest of beauty, aided also especially by the great poet Dante Alighieri and Goethe. Let me read you a quote referring to this time. Reflecting about poetry, Giacomo Leopardi says, "A poet must be original, not suffocated by study and imitation." I think this states very clearly his transition. He had written tragedies in his early years, but according to his own testimony, these tragedies were suffocated by imitation and by study. Only the first poet in history of humanity could have been truly original, since he had no one to influence him. It was therefore necessary to get as close to the originals by drawing inspiration from one's own feelings without imitating anyone. This is the first major transition that we find in the life and the thought of Giacomo Leopardi. The second transition, that goes dal bello al vero, from beauty to truth, happened around the year 1819. And it is there where the poet yields to the philosopher. The poet and the philosopher come together in Giacomo Leopardi. However, the emphasis shifts. His early poetry is philosophical, of course. His later philosophy is poetical, just as well. But the emphasis shifts, and by the way, this is something very hard to accomplish in philosophy. Many outstanding philosophers are very poor writers. Because there's no power of imagination. For most philosophers, imagination is a hindrance. When you try to think about essence or being, if you imagine something, you're already out of track. Imagination hinders philosophy to a significant extent. So the fact that Giacomo Leopardi can embellish his philosophy in a very poetical way is something remarkable and worth highlighting. I also want to call your attention on how early these transitions happen in Giacomo Leopardi's life. We find someone who has fully matured in his early 20s and who has accumulated all the knowledge that he could possibly accumulate from his reading also in his early 20s. It was in his late teens that he transitions from erudition to poetry. And it is in his early 20s that he transitions from beauty to truth. While almost every theme Giacomo Leopardi touches upon experiences some kind of evolution, the philosophical value and the systematic consistency of Leopardi has been stressed by scholars who deepen into him. Nonetheless, take for example nature. Does he reflect about nature? Yes, of course, he reflects about nature. If you have read the last song of Sappho, he begins with a mention of the moon and how the moon is shedding its light upon the waters of the sea. That nature is placid, is benevolent, is beautiful, and it's a contrast with the viewer who's ugly, who regards himself as ugly. So nature at first is charming. There's beauty in nature, which doesn't mean Giacomo Leopardi finds joy in it. On the contrary, he finds sorrow because he compares himself with nature and he sees how nature is beautiful and lushful, while I am crippled, I am sick, and I am ugly. This brings along the second phase of nature. According to Giacomo Leopardi, nature is not a mother. Nature is an evil stepmother. Nature is cruel. Nature finds delight in devouring and torturing her own children. You can see that, for example, in the dialogue of the Icelander and nature. The Icelander is trying to escape from nature, and nature just mocks him. You are like a squirrel trying to escape from a snake. And that's how man is regarded by Leopardi. Leopardi envisions man like this poor, insignificant creature trying to escape from the forces of nature to no avail. The third step, or the third view that he adopts upon nature, is just to regard nature as something indifferent. It's not like nature is positively trying to crush and torture her own children. She just doesn't care for them. And in that indifference and in that neglect, Giacomo Leopardi finds his complaint and his sorrow. As part of his legacy, we find one of the most challenging thinkers of all of the 19th century. Chesterton, the British essay writer, and he wrote like 90 books and 4,000 essays, so he wrote a lot. In one of his writings, don't ask me which one because he wrote not a lot, he wrote too much. He says, even before he became a Catholic, if the span of human existence were 1,000 years, everyone would either end up as a Catholic or as a nihilist. For Chesterton, everything else are just midpoints in between. With Giacomo Leopardi, we find someone who in a very short span of time could go through all of those steps to the ultimate step of nihilism. He carries nihilism to its ultimate consequences. He's profoundly radical. So he has no qualms in cutting off with any psychological attachment. His own experience of suffering and rejection bring forth, at first, a profound poetical talent, but eventually they not only bring poetry, they bring forth a deep philosophical reflection. In Giacomo Leopardi, we find someone who dares to look at the problem of suffering face to face. He doesn't struggle to conceal or to hide those uncomfortable truths we'd rather not look at. And when I say he's challenging and he is contrary to convention, of course, take that to the religious sphere of his time. Of course, he challenges that, but not only. Maybe it's even more remarkable how he questions the ideal of illuminism, of enlightenment. Enlightenment that envisioned reason like that element that would bring mankind to its progress and completion, that is not only questioned, but denied by Giacomo Leopardi. So he questions that ideal of progress that the Enlightenment had brought into European thinking. Remember when we spoke about Mary Shelley, how the monster could be a symbol of the French Revolution? Those ideals of fraternity, of equality, and of freedom that had turned against us. Maybe what Giacomo Leopardi does is to put those feelings and crystallizes them into very concrete and well laid out ideas. As we began saying, death is his most common theme. However, pay attention to this fact. Reading Giacomo Leopardi is not depressing. It can even be uplifting. Why? On the one hand, I think because of his poetical beauty. So he can be dealing with very crude realities and very crude themes, but he embellishes them with his poetical talent. But above all, it's not only that he embellishes things that are ugly in themselves. It is his human spirit that dares to rise and confront the powers of nature. I think that's one of the great highlights of Giacomo Leopardi. Reading him is not depressing. Pessimism. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote an essay about Giacomo Leopardi. In it, he calls him, and rightfully so, he calls Giacomo Leopardi the father of pessimism. And to a significant extent, Giacomo Leopardi can also be called the father of existentialism and the father of nihilism. You would say that eventually Arthur Schopenhauer or Nietzsche would take these ideas farther, but really they are not taking them farther ahead. They are just deriving the consequences. With Giacomo Leopardi, we find the kernel of the problem. How is this pessimism stressed? At least on three different levels: cosmic, social, and individual. Let me begin with cosmic pessimism. Nature mocks mankind and asks ironically, do you think all this world was made for you? So nature, in every single recess, in every single particle, is loaded with death and decay. In one of his essays, Giacomo Leopardi pictures a very beautiful garden, blooming, springtime. You say, well, this is the most beautiful thing that we can encounter in nature. If it's not the most beautiful thing, it's one of the most beautiful things we can find in nature. And if you look closely, you are going to see that this weed is already creeping in, that other flower is withering, that other tree is secreting some poisonous resin, that bugs are struggling. So there's death all over in the universe. Social. I have a very good quote, so I don't want to skip this quote. I'm just afraid I lost it. But I have to find this quote because it will represent very well what I mean about social pessimism. For Giacomo Leopardi, moral is meaningless. Jove, meaning the Greek, the Roman god, only favors the strong. Here it is. Jove rewards only the selfish and plays arbitrary games with hapless mankind. Man is more unhappy than the rest of the animal kingdom because the latter don't know that they are unhappy and therefore do not meditate on the question of suicide, and even if they could, nothing would prevent them from carrying out the act without hesitation. Moral pessimism and social pessimism. Let me bring here a quick parenthesis. At the end of his life, Giacomo Leopardi, in his Testament poem, La Ginestra, presents some kind of proposal. And he says, we humans should unite and confront nature because we are all being pressed by nature. Cosmic pessimism versus social pessimism. Although maybe this was only wishful thinking. Finally, individual pessimism. Individual pessimism. Pessimism at an individual level. What's the point of human existence? Speaking about the individual. If every individual life will be quenched by death. In a very good dialogue, by the way, there's a scholar from the Netherlands. He lived in the 1600s. His name is Ruish. Ruish was a mummifier. He mummified corpses. Now, according to this dialogue, at a certain point in the night, because of the alignment of the stars, the dead come back to life. And the mummies start exchanging their opinions with Ruish. And it's a very powerful and insightful dialogue where they state how it is to be dead. We are better than you because at least we don't suffer. All that death brings to mankind, it's not pleasure, it's not joy, but it's the end of suffering. I know this might all be very pessimistic, and rightfully so, because he wanted to be pessimistic. By the way, Arthur Schopenhauer also states that pessimism, it's not necessarily understood on a derogatory or a pejorative sense. Maybe in our days, to call someone a pessimist is some kind of reviling insult, but back then it wasn't. It was an approach on life. It was an outlook. It was just a perspective to look at life. However, I think it's gonna shed a lot of light on these questions and on these matters if I finish with a quote of Ratzinger from Jesus of Nazareth, part 1, chapter 6. Faith in the one God is the only thing that truly liberates the world and makes it rational. When faith is absent, Giacomo Leopardi, the world only appears to be more rational. In reality, the indeterminable powers of chance now claim their due. Chaos theory takes its place alongside insight into the rational structure of the universe, confronting man with obscurities that he cannot resolve and that set limits to the world's rationality. To exorcise the world, meaning to establish it in the light of reason that comes from the eternal creative reason and its saving goodness and refers back to it, that is a permanent central task of the messengers of Jesus Christ. Okay? I hope this session was informative to you, and if it touched your feelings in a particular way, I'm happy, because I think that's what Giacomo Leopardi wanted to do. He wanted to touch our feelings in a deep way, and I hope this will trigger our reflection. Thank you very much, everyone.